Oh, I know what that is. I can tell you all about that.
Welcome to the Witness Box, everybody. I'm your host, Joshua Diaz, alongside my co-host, and as always, Chris McDonough of the Interview Room. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing great.
It's good to see you. Good to hear from you. Dr. Gary Brucato, and we are going to talk about an interesting subject tonight, one that's right up Dr. Gary's alley, and it is how do we define evil? And we're going to talk a little bit about where the crossover happens and what would make us define that, and also talk a little bit about being in the presence of evil. And Dr. Gary, how are you?
Well, thank you. I do think that talking about evil is a very important, sometimes controversial conversation to have. But I'm glad we're going to have it from a philosophical perspective. I think it's really worth having, and I think before we even start to talk about evil, I just think, given how dark some of the stuff is we're going to talk about, that number one, we may want to kind of let people know that we'll try to be sensitive in our descriptions of some of the most evil cases, quote unquote, in the annals of crime. But they may be activating to some people who have been affected by violent crime. And secondly, I think we really want to dedicate the conversation to the victims of violent crime, to whom I think we always want to be extremely sensitive. So wouldn't you echo that, Chris and Josh?
100%.
I mean,
I'm really fascinated to learn about the evolution of, what the human spirit's capable of.
Well, all right. Well, let's jump right in. I mean, I think I want to give a little bit of background, because remember that Michael Stone, who had written a prominent book on the subject of evil called The Anatomy of Evil, which is a book that came out of his interest in people who have what psychiatrically are called serious personality disorders of the type that can be associated with outrageous cruelty, psychopathic types of people, extremely narcissistic types of people, extremely sadistic types of people can do pretty awful things. But technically speaking, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, what used to be called sadistic personality disorder, these are medical conditions, right? They're psychiatric conditions. Michael was interested in really getting to the heart of the moral depravity that can be at the center of these things when we don't think of them as illnesses fully, but as partly representing depraved choices and cruel and selfish choices that people can make as human beings, where they're not really suffering the way a medical condition should make a person suffer, but making other people suffer. And so when Michael did the sequel of the book, The New Evil, as many of the listeners will know, I was the person he picked to co-write it with him, and we sort of expanded the way his scale of evil is used. And I learned a great deal about the history of the term and how Michael came to think about it. And I want to discuss it a little bit, because I think it lays a great foundation for what we're going to talk about tonight. So first of all, it's important to understand that most languages really don't have multiple words for different degrees of bad. English is unusual in that we have this word evil to mean like a very exaggerated degree of badness. But in most languages, the word is identical for evil and bad. And our word evil is very, very interesting, because it comes from the Germanic übel, which means extra or beyond, over. And this is important because it gets right to the heart of the difference between bad and evil. A person who is doing something that would be called evil is doing something that is not necessary practically for the commission of a crime, but is doing so with an extra that has to do with his or her personality or fantasy needs. And so there's a level of cruelty that is totally not needed, right? Simple example. Dr. Gary Christ was ultimately a physician. He was a guy who was a kidnapper who abducted Barbara Mackle, who was associated with the Nixon family in the 70s, kidnapped her from a hotel room while she was with her mother recovering from an illness. And instead of just putting her up for ransom, which was the practical goal, bad goal, he decided for his narcissistic amusement that he was going to bury her alive in a homemade coffin box with an air tube that went up to the ground.
Wow.
And it was fitted with feminine products, a kerosene lantern, a little note that said, "Don't worry, you'll be out before Christmas." And she was in there at great length. The lights went out immediately. She could hear the people walking up on the soil, sucking air through that tube to breathe. There was no reason to do that. That was an evil that went beyond the kidnapping, which is the bad part. And so you want to understand that one of the first key elements of the construct of evil is that it's not necessary to do something bad. It's the extra. And the second thing,
an interesting point, real fast, Gary. Before,
please, yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is both a noun and an adverb, right? I mean, in an evil manner, and yet, the fact of suffering.
Yeah.
It covers both English descriptions of what you're getting into here. I mean, because she's underground, help us understand the psychology behind. Okay, I had her physically, but now he's disassociating himself with her and putting her into the.
I think because what it implies is that if you're dealing with a person whose personality structure is fundamentally prone to enjoying being cruel to people,
fascinating,
right, then the practical now overlaps with the personality and the fantasy needs. So like when Michael and I talk about degrees of evil, the low part of the scale is for people where there's only the practical. I'm killing somebody to get revenge. I'm, without much thought. It's impulsive. Jealousy, that's a killing that is purely impulsive. I'm extremely angry and I explode. It's self-defense. It's I'm traumatized and I act out. These are things that human beings could kind of get.
So what you're saying,
you move up, right, and then your personality and fantasy play out. That's a different.
What you're saying there is that when you said that there was no reason to do it, that there are extenuating circumstances in which people can understand why somebody would hurt somebody, kill somebody, harm somebody. But then from that point after that, if he's putting her underground and putting the tube down there, he's doing that because he enjoys it.
And that's precisely it. In other words, anyone in a jury could comprehend somebody who wanted money, kidnapped a person at gunpoint, right, from a hotel room, and put her up for ransom. We can get that. It's awful. It could reflect some aberrant personality, greed, terrible, moral lapse in judgment. But to go to the extreme that only for one's cruel and sadistic amusement to put the individual underground for days, in the pitch dark, with the idea that they could suffocate down there, be buried alive, was totally unnecessary. I'll give you another example of this distinction. There was a case in Florida that haunts me. It's one of those cases that I'm thinking of including in the book I'm working on of the 20 cases that just like leave a knot in my stomach. It was a sex offender called John Cooey. And he abducted a little girl from, her name was Jessica Lunford, I think. Yes, Jessica Lunford, from trailer. And he was keeping her in a closet and assaulting her, and then eventually told her he was going to bring her home to her mother. So he puts her in a garbage bag to carry over his back to bring home to the mother, dump on the lawn or something. But he decides, because he was a cruel person, that just for fun, maybe he should dig a hole in the yard and bury the child alive. And she died. The autopsy showed enormous amounts of soil had been inhaled into the lung in an effort to breathe underground. That was evil. The abduction of the child and the sexual offense, of course, also is disgusting, evil, awful, personality aberration, paraphilia, the whole thing. But that super evil, the extreme thing that is shocking and horrible and that nobody could comprehend, was why it was necessary for the girl to die that way. There was no practical purpose for it. It was for his amusement that he had lied to the child and made her think she was going to go home to her mother. And Chris, as someone who has worked on child offenses of that type, you've seen an awful lot of evil. I mean, and we're going to definitely get into that, but I just want to lay some of these ground rules here. So first of all, in the most general terms, evil, most people think it just means, something that's harmful or painful or unpleasant, right? And what happens is, if you look at the literature on evil, you see that it breaks up into three types, and we're going to be talking really about one of them. But so natural evil just means stuff that where the world is hard on us, right? COVID, volcanoes, things like that. And it's very interesting because we've always named those things. Like we name hurricanes to make it feel like it's a human that's hurting us because it feels like it's doing evil to us, right? So we
Yeah,
name.
I'm a little offended by that because right now Chris is on the horizon. That's a hurricane.
Oh,
That's next in
yeah,
line. And we're talking about, this depravity here. And they got a doggone hurricane they're going to name after me. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm a nice guy. They can't do that. I didn't mean to digress, but I wanted to break it up for a second. So,
Hurricane Dr. Gary is scheduled for later in December.
well, yeah, I mean, again, we're in a master class here with the master.
I love it. That's so funny. But I there was a Hurricane Gary once, actually. And moral evil is what most people think of as evil, which is cruel and vicious and unjust things that are done intentionally to hurt other people. And then there's this other topic which is worthy of a whole episode, which is metaphysical evil. And that's the spiritual idea that human beings, just by virtue of not being gods or not being God, are fundamentally flawed, that they require some kind of salvation or some higher power to overcome the fundamental flaw that is in them. And so metaphysical evil is quite interesting. Actually, in most religions, especially in early Christianity, the idea of evil is that it was called privation. And privation means that evil is not really a thing. Evil is the absence of a thing. It's the absence of goodness. It's sort of like saying dark is nothing more than a very low amount of light, or cold is nothing more than a very low amount of heat. So they would say evil doesn't exist. It is by definition a negative. It is a non-entity. It is the total black hole absence of God, right? Which is a very, very interesting idea. Now, then, and I'll spare the audience, what they can look up themselves, all the different faiths, ideas about religions, ideas about evil, everything from ideas about balance between light and dark, and about the need for a savior, or the idea that evil has to do with an imbalance or something wrong in the home that then extends to the society. These are all ideas that people can look up themselves. But I want to get into the kind of evil we mean here. So what it is important to understand that the way Michael and I talk about it is the same way that you'll hear newspaper people, judges, cops, detectives, podcasters, etc. Even mental health professionals use that word, even though they don't use it in documents. They certainly say it. I've heard judges say things like, "You are the most evil offender that has ever walked into this courtroom." You are when Cameron Hooker was before the judge for keeping a woman in a coffin 23 hours a day, which was embedded in his and his wife's bed, so that she had to learn to dislocate her limbs to push a dish under herself to go to the bathroom. The judge said, "You are the most evil psychopath." Right? And in other words, that he didn't kill, but it was worse than killing someone, what he had done to that woman for 3 years, I think. And so you want to understand that The word is commonly used, even though it's not officially used. And Michael and I were wondering about that word. How do you describe it? If you take religion off the table, we thought perhaps it's a kind of emotional reaction. It's that the way that a person feels looking at an act, right, is where we placed the definition. And we found that all acts that people agreed were evil have four characteristics. First characteristic is the act has to be premeditated. Can't call something evil if it was an accident. It's premeditated. Number two, anyone in any time or any place would consider it evil. Can't be something that in one culture is fine and another one thinks it's not. It's something that everyone just on some level understands is terrible, right? Like the sexual assault of a child. You're going to find pretty much nobody that thinks that's okay. The violation of a corpse, things like that. And then the third characteristic is it's shocking and bewildering to the average person because it goes beyond the human understanding of motive. So, like, a jury isn't even going to understand it, right? Like, why did this person kill 50 people? Well, because they got sexual arousal from going out and finding people who reminded them of their abusive mother, bringing them home to a torture chamber, strapping them up, abusing them in every imaginable way, killing them and dumping them on the highway. And he'd get aroused by that and keep trophies from it. And the jury is like, what? Right. And Chris, you've seen this. You understand when people just can't grasp it, right? So because it's so beyond the human, it's so evil, right? The evil. And then the fourth is that it it brings about wildly excessive degrees of suffering, even in the people that are affected indirectly. So, one of the things Michael and I found to be characteristic of evil is that sometimes the act is done so that even when somebody is killed, the people who find the body or have to look at, or the family that has to hear the details, have to be horrified beyond words. And Chris and I have seen that. Josh, you've experienced it, that kind of vicarious evil. And so as the audience is definitely going to pick up right away, there's going to be a lot of overlap here with religious metaphysical evil, and we can talk a little bit about that. But I think the key is that now that the stage has been set, what I would really hope we could do is really have a rich discussion about cases and in the media and experiences we've had where we really find ourselves face to face with someone whose motive was not a practical one, but was the expression of a loathing for a group or a loathing for humankind or women or some perverse fantasy, and there was no need to do what they did other than to just be horrible. And the final thing I'll say in the ground rules is we don't generally say people are evil. We say their deeds are. That because Michael and I were only able to identify a couple of people, less than one hand, even in the worst offenders, who didn't have a couple of people in their lives who liked them. That's the most disturbing part of all is we want to think of these people as like the living devil, in red tights with the horns and the long tail. But the truth is, this could be anybody. This could
Well,
be anybody, which is, I think, a great segue into opening up the conversation. But this can be anybody. So I hope that clarified a little bit about what we think about evil, and I hope you guys think that's interesting.
certainly does.
Yeah. So
You know,
let's open it up. So what do you think?
the definition of evil typically is like profound immorality. When you think about that, it's not just being immoral, it's beyond that. It's the profound acts, like you were saying.
Right.
And it's really hard to tell a difference, because I hear I hear when people say things like, somebody does something, they're like a serial killer or a mass shooter or whatever it is that you want to say, and they'll say that, they're evil, or
Right.
what they did obviously wasn't necessary. There was no reason to do that. And then you kind of get into, well, are they sick in the head? Were they sick? Do they have a mental disorder or whatever? Did
Rarely.
they?
Rarely.
Right. And so, but I would say that anybody that is capable of committing a heinous crime would have some sort of imbalance meaning that, they don't think like a normal person. They don't do things that a normal person would do. It's not normal to kill somebody. Just
Well,
flat.
this is a very important. You got to a point very early in the conversation. Most people tend to get to in the end when I discuss this in different places. You have to understand that the roots of psychiatry and what we now call, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. That's the Bible that we all use in mental health. It has its origins in philosophy, biology, and theology, right? That's who you used to go talk to. A spiritual leader, a a physician, right? Or like a philosopher about your problems.
Right.
And the personality disorders are a mixture of things that are kind of biological and moral. The cluster B personalities are moral problems, many of them, that have to do with selfishness, interpersonal cruelty, etc. Now, there is this very special category that Hare talks about and Keckley called psychopathy, not in the DSM. And the reason is this: when they were creating the DSM, they wanted it to be totally objective, things that could just be observed by a doctor. Problem with psychopathy is there are a lot of traits of it that have to be felt. They're not just observed. So they didn't put that category in. And to this day, the worst offenders are people we would call psychopaths, right? They're psychopaths. And we know that psychopaths do tend to have some abnormalities when you do MRIs with them, right? There could be problems in their emotional centers, their judgment centers. They're not afraid, they're bored, they're sensation seeking, etc. But they're not sick in the way that you're talking about. There is a smattering of people who commit these crimes that are deeply disturbed, like Albert Fish, who was a psychopath, but he was also completely psychotic and heard voices commanded that he castrate children and things like that, right? But most of these people, the most frightening thing about them is that they are not unwell in the way that you mean it. They are unwell in the sense that their personality's messed up. They're mad at the world. They feel entitled to level the playing field through these horrible acts. So that's what I think one of the things I really want to get to, and I think Chris, you and I will have a ton to say about this because of our work, is that every once in a while you'll sit in a room with a person who is cool, collected, level-headed, organized, even high functioning, even likable. And they have, in the cold reptilian way that you hear about it, like in the movies and books and things, been able to do things against children or women or both or men or whatever that are so awful, so vile, so disgusting that you can't understand how they can compartmentalize that and still be a human being. And that's what we have to talk about if we're going to talk about evil. We're not talking about the ice cream man here.
Right.
Well, in some cases, I guess you can be, but we're not talking about the ice cream man here. We're talking about evil. So there's going to be some dark stuff here. And Chris, I mean, I think a really good example of someone that I know you've encountered, pure evil, and you know where I'm going with.
Mhm.
I mean, you met Wilson, right?
Yeah, I interviewed him, and he demonstrated his crime on me. And in fact, I can, if you want to, do you mind if we play it for a second? You can hear the sound.
I'm not sure what it's going to show, but I certainly know the case.
Yeah, no, this is crazy.
Which I understand had a big effect on bathroom laws, didn't it, Chris? This case?
Yeah, it was this case determined whether or not they had family restrooms. It was called the Matthew Checky's Law.
Oh, look, I just had my 12th birthday.
Oh, really? This was your birthday?
Well, yeah, November 15th, Wes. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Happy birthday, Josh.
Tell me if you can hear this.
Here, in the back. And tell me to stand up. Go ahead. Please. I stand up. Well, he's there. And I'm like, and when I've been thinking about this, I was thinking I wanted to take something from him, that I wanted to drink his blood or something. But I don't really think about doing it with this one. Mm-hmm. So you wanted something from him. Okay. So how many times did you stab him where did you stab him? In the back. Yeah, where? Just once. Okay, where though? Right right here.
Okay.
Okay, it's just,
Can you see where? Okay, and around there.
yeah,
Okay.
and it's just
Show me where about the area.
like right in there.
Okay, right in there. So you're doing it a lot of times there. You're doing it multiple times. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
And, I mean, it didn't.
Okay,
He's
let's.
already dead, I mean, I just did it just to do it.
Okay, so you did it after you knew he was already dead. Okay, so let's say I'm the kid. Okay, let's act this out. Okay, are you with me on that? Okay. Let's say I'm here, and Tom, why don't you move over there for a second? Okay, Brandon, come on over here and show me. Okay, now be gentle with me now, okay? Okay, I'm the kid. What am I doing?
You're pissed.
Okay, I'm taking a leap?
Yeah.
Okay, and what do you do now? Show me.
Okay, I walk around you this way and you look at me.
Okay, I look over like this?
And you say no, but I kind of smile and I nod.
Okay.
I smile and I nod. You know me.
Okay.
I'm going to kill you.
Does he look back?
Yes. He looks back.
Okay, then what happens?
I stop. I take out my knife.
Okay. I notice you pulled out your knife like that. Is that where you had it?
I have it right here.
Okay, that's cool. Then what happens?
I'm sticking it out like this.
Right?
I got it all figured out. I got to put it in the sheath the right way so the sharp end is here.
Right?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
I go up behind him.
Go ahead, show me.
Grab him like this.
Right?
I take him like this.
Right? And you let it have it.
Yes.
Then what do you do?
Hold him like this.
Okay.
He's spurting.
Right.
Spurting.
Okay, good.
Okay. And he's starting to sink down.
Okay, then what happens? You let him have it like that?
One more time.
Then what
He
happens?
goes down. He goes all the way down.
All the way down?
He's down on the
And
ground.
then what happens?
I'm leaning over him.
Right?
I take the knife.
Right?
Stab him like this.
Right.
One last time.
Right?
Pull it out.
And then what happens then?
He's dead. I stand up. Still backing away. And here's mother's voice.
You hear his mother's voice?
That's evil.
Yeah, well, if I remember that case, Chris, he tried to say that he was psychotic and that God had told him to kill an innocent. And they said he was a psychedelic drug user and everything else. But I think at the end of the day, this was just a guy with a perverse fantasy about killing a kid, right?
Yeah, and
Chris, did you feel he was really getting worked up while reenacting that?
absolutely, he was
Reliving it.
He looked
It was
around,
the-
actually.
it was the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was the
Counted
moment.
it too.
Yeah. But
Well-
but Chris, did you think he was psychotic, or did you think that he was a person with an aberrant personality who was kind of got a perverse thrill out of killing a kid for no reason?
The latter.
Yeah.
And I think he had a bout with narcotics
Mhm.
because he used to go out to the desert and take mushrooms and have conversations with God and dogs and
Mhm.
everything. And so, but in that particular day, what it's not shared very often, but the public should be aware of it. I mean, he went after he had murdered Matthew. He ran down the beach. He ran south on the beach and came up behind a hotel that he was staying at.
Mhm.
And he went into the room and he spent, a lot of money watching pornography right after that. And then he told me, he said, I wanted to go out and do it again. But there were too many cops and there were too many, news and all this other stuff. He said, I thought I would get caught. And that's when he, for the thrill of it, went down the street to a barber, got a haircut, cut all his hair off. And then he went to the bus station, bought a ticket for the next day on a Greyhound bus. And the next morning he woke up and walked to the Greyhound bus station, jumped on the bus, and went to West Hollywood, LA.
Well, Chris, I think you would agree that, first of all, I mean, for you and for me, this is, we day in and day out talk about offenders with this kind of progression. But I think for the audience, just want to clarify, I think what you're implying is that he watched the pornography because he was so sexually aroused by having killed a child. And this implies that he easily could have become a serial killer.
Well, and you'll notice you heard him say, with this one. I wasn't sure if I wanted to drink his blood or with this one.
Wow.
And so, and that was kind of our thinking too at the time, even was, had he done this before or is he going to do it again? And almost immediately when he got to LA, he stepped off the bus And near the bus station in West Hollywood is a neighborhood where he attacked a woman and a Hispanic gal and stabbed her many, many times.
Oh.
And citizens intervened right away and basically held him down like they did Ramirez.
Did she live?
Yeah, they beat him up pretty bad.
But the lady lived?
Yeah, she lived, but the LAPD was going to charge him with attempted murder when there was a great detective named Thune and another guy named Mike McDonough, if you can believe that. That's kind of it's a funny story for a very tragic situation. My phone rings from the secretary and she's like, "Hey, Mac, LAPD's on the phone. They got a guy in custody. They want to know if they want to talk to you." Yeah. And so I picked up the phone and I said, "McDonough." He goes, "Yeah, McDonough." I said, "Yeah, McDonough." He goes, "Yeah, McDonough." And it's like we're playing Laurel and Hardy here for a moment. Who's on first?
Right.
And I said, "Who is this?" He goes, "Mike McDonough, LAPD." I said, "Oh, you're kidding. You must be my long lost cousin." Anyway, we started laughing a little bit. And then he tells me, "Hey, I got this guy up here. And, what kind of holdback information do you have on this, your caper with the kid?" And I said, "Well, he stabbed the little boy in the upper quadrant in the back." And I told him specifics. And he says, "Okay, I'll call you back." Mm-hmm. And he goes in and interviews the guy again, Wilson. He says, "Where'd you stab the kid?" And he goes, "Well, most of the time you heard him on the video say, 'I did it just to do it.'"
That's the extra.
The extra, right. And so he thought that was, important for him. And so Mike called me back and said, "Hey, this is what he said." And I said, "Bingo." I said, "That's our guy. I'm on my way." And so I drove up to the LAPD West Hollywood, and he was sitting there in the bullpen, which we call it, watching all the love and everything going on there. He was the star, the celebrity. And, that's another story, but, Park Dietz helped us on that one. And
that was Dave Rubin was the prosecutor, right?
Dave Rubin was the prosecutor.
Because I remember a quote from Dave Rubin. It's like one of those things that I could still see it when I closed my eyes because it upset me so much, so deeply. I remember that Rubin said in that infamous case that it took about 10 seconds for that boy to die.
Yeah.
And he told the jury that the last thing Checky would have seen was that with every heartbeat, he would have seen his own blood hitting the wall.
Correct.
And, and then the shock and the horror in the audience is what we call evil, right? That's the experience of evil. And it's that feeling of, I just got a little taste of hell, of whatever that darkness is that human beings are capable of. And that's just it. Where is that dividing line? Why do people, even professional people, find themselves saying that? Chris, I have no doubt that when you reflect on that case, you would call it evil.
Oh, no question about it. I mean, when the one thing about being a case agent on those kind of things, right? You're the lead investigator. Mm-hmm. So, at that time, I was 10 years into homicide. So I had a lot of experience, already under my belt. And I'd done other very high profile, other stuff, other cases we can talk about on other programs. But by that point, but what I remember, what stuck out to me is when I got there, and it's really interesting because people are going to think this is crazy, but it happened. Karen and I were walking in Balboa Park. We were on a date. And
it was in the 90s?
Yeah, it was in the late, almost 2000, right? 98, November 98. And we're walking and, we're just in love and everything. And I had this impression something big had gone down. And I turned to her, I said, I think something's happening. And she was kind of like, huh? I said, no, I feel like something big's going to happen. And within 5 minutes, back then we carried pagers, right? Because you're on a 24-hour call out, beep, 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 beep. And it says 911. So I have to call dispatch, so I'm running to go find a phone because we didn't have cell phones back then. Okay. Not the portable ones anyway. And I ran and found a phone. I called dispatch. I said, "What's up?" And they go, "Hey, we've got a 187 with a little boy in a bathroom down at the harbor. You need to respond. We got everybody coming." And so we had like 14.
You were a child specialist, right? A child crime
Yes,
specialist,
right.
right?
Yeah. And I said, "Okay, en route." So we could drive our company cars everywhere. So I had a phone in my car. Anyway, Karen and I jumped in the car and I took off. And we drove to the harbor. When I remember pulling up, there were like 13 satellite trucks from the news markets out front of this bathroom. And long story short, I remember, circling up, making my boss says, "Okay, Mac, you're the lead on this thing. Go in and tell us what we're looking at." And in my mind, even this very moment, talking about this, I remember walking into that restroom. I had a criminalist with me, so I wasn't going to cross contaminate or step on something. And I had my flashlight. It was pitch black inside the restroom because by this time it's evening, right? He was killed early evening, and around sunset. To be honest with you,
I think they were having a family reunion at the restaurant or something.
yes, there were the grandparents. There were many family members there. They had a motorhome down there.
I wondered if that was a coincidence, Chris, because I remember Checky saying he hated his mother and had fantasized about killing her from when he was about 16.
Yes,
And I think it's very telling that he might have spied that this kid was with this big loving family for a get together, have been terribly envious. And I mean, it's like this thing of, my mother doesn't care about me. Nobody cares about me. Why should I, anybody love this kid? That kind of thing. Makes me wonder if you followed him in after seeing he was with the family. But it's an interesting way to think about it, because it adds a layer of that darkness of being spiteful and jealous and
yeah. And when
yeah.
that is a really interesting observation for sure. Let me show you this picture real fast.
Yeah, the kid is really cute. I hate looking at him because he was such a sweet.
I'm not going to show you him. I will later, in private, but we can talk about this real fast. So this was the setup. You can see where we had everything shut down all around that entire bathroom, and Shecky'd come in through the right side there in that bathroom, and Matthew had come in there, and then Brandon came in right behind him.
Oh.
But when I remember walking into that bathroom and seeing on the wall arterial spray from the child.
That's what that's what the prosecutor was talking about, right?
Yeah. And we had to get this is the next morning, by the way, this picture right here. Okay. We had to get our criminalist in there and blood spatter experts, and we were able now look at this tattoo, but I don't say anything yet, Gary, but that was the name on his left arm. The public has never heard this. And so as I remember standing there and looking, And of course, Matthew, God bless his soul and rest in peace, that I look down and I see this little boy, and, the horrific scene of that in of itself. Blood is everywhere, absolutely everywhere, because when he was killing him, he was moving him. And it was, the carotid artery had been cut instantly. So every heartbeat, that boy was bleeding out and draining it. So, and literally, if you listen to Wilson in that video, he's saying spurting, spurting, spurting. And that's exactly what was happening. And the interior of that bathroom, the walls were just, just caked with blood spatter. And we were able to determine how tall Wilson could have been based on that evidence, because you take measurements in certain directions and that kind of stuff. But we are able to figure out, okay, this guy could have been around this height, this range, etc. And I remember, by this point, looking around the walls, and I could see also one other place that was transferred. It looked like the suspect had, gotten some blood on their clothing and rubbed the wall as they were leaving. And it was just a single swipe of what appeared to be transfer. And as I walked out, I remember going back to the team, and we were all there, the criminalist, everybody. And my boss at the time says, what do we have? And I remember vividly telling him, he was asking about evidence, right? And I said nothing. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, we may have some transfer on the side wall from his clothing. Hopefully there's fiber or any kind of trace evidence that could have been transferred from the suspect, to that environment. Because, God always, my philosophy has always been God leaves a witness, no matter what. If it's a hare or a dog, etc. He always leaves a witness. But I remember in this case, just standing there, and I was in there, probably 20 minutes, just taking it in and thinking to myself, what kind of animal would do this? And I don't know about you in your experiences, Gary, but I kind of go into this hunting mode where I get very, very intense in terms of my thinking, my clarity, and I listen to every single thought, every single idea, it's almost as if time slows down for me when I'm involved in these intense homicides like this. And I'm very open to my entire environment and listening to everything around it. And
Well, in the video you showed us, Chris, you literally became the child, the victim.
yes,
You
right,
allowed the offender to stand behind you and replicate
yes,
what you did to the child,
That
and
was
you were in
wild.
the same body position with your
Wild.
neck back and everything. And in that moment, it was almost as if
He was reliving it, Dr.
you
Gary, don't you think?
exactly you were watching somebody reliving it, and you were able to completely put yourself into the shoes.
Yeah. How did you feel? Did you feel vulnerable?
I didn't, because I was trying to feel Matthew.
Well, that's it. That's what you. But Chris, the other thing is that never made sense to me is the kid was urinating.
Right.
Was there no touching?
Was what?
Was there no touching of the child?
Oh, no, he did not molest the child at
Right.
all.
So, but in other words, it can't be a coincidence that it was in a vulnerable position when he was exposed, because he went afterwards. It was a total sex offense. He went afterwards and copiously masturbated, watching pornography.
Right, but I think that's a great point. And what people forget is before he killed Matthew,
Yeah.
he was walking northbound on the beach, and he ran into another young lady.
hmm
And at the time, they were dredging the harbor, and they were bringing all that excess of sand. They were pumping it south back down onto the beaches, and there was these huge, like sand dunes, berms of sand. So if you stood, what we call the Strand, which is a road that runs parallel with the beach, you cannot see the water's edge.
Oh.
So Wilson had gone over that berm, and he was walking southbound on the beach, and she was walking northbound on the beach. Now, this is about an hour and a half before he kills Matthew. And he runs across this young girl.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was the original desired target, potentially?
Yes. And in his mind, he tells me in that interview, at the full-length interview, he says, well, I wanted to kill her and rape her. Okay. I wanted to rape her. Okay. But I couldn't tell if somebody could see me. And if I did, then I was going to have to throw her body into the water. And I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. And so the girl tells me, yeah, when I see this guy, he's like full on creepy, weird. I see his eyes, they look, evil, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
And she goes, as he started to talk to me, I just had this feeling I needed to get out of there. And she followed her gut, and she literally took off eastbound over the berm from the water's edge and ran up a flight of stairs. And he was mad that he didn't attack her quick enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he took off northbound on the beach and ended up at that bathroom where he saw the children playing. And I think he realized, okay, I need a much more vulnerable target because, it didn't work out on what I was getting ready to do. So
but Chris, his fantasy had always been to kill his mother.
Yes.
So a female target makes sense.
Yeah. He stood behind her actually when he was 16. Mm-hmm. And to your point. Yeah.
Yeah, and the mother dead. I never understood the story of why, but he hated her and fantasized about her murder for a long time.
She was having an affair at the school.
Ah, interesting.
And he resented that. It embarrassed him in high school. And soon after that, he burnt down a cabin one time in Wisconsin. He went on a meth binge one time and went through the windshield of a truck that he got in a car accident. He got a settlement, and he traveled the country with, I think he got like $12,000 and traveled the U.S. And that's where he first discovered Southern California and came to Southern California and would hang out in Joshua Tree.
Yeah.
He would take, psychedelics, etc.
Yeah, but you would see why he would have been jealous now of an intact family.
Yeah, it would make sense. And at the time,
I would bet my life that was the impetus.
So who was this on his arm?
Oh, I know what that is. I could tell you a little about that.
Okay. I want to hear you.
That's if I'm not mistaken, it says Rex nemorensis, right?
Correct.
So Rex nemorensis.
And by the way, this is the first time, Josh, I've ever shown this picture. Okay. Right. And that the public has ever heard this information about Brandon Wilson. This is the very first time. So we're going to get a doctor's assessment because he knows. And I knew he would. That's why I showed this.
If it's weird and obscure, I've heard it from.
Yeah, Gary knows. Go ahead. Tell the public.
So Rex Nemorensis, this was the priest of the goddess Diana on the lake of Nemo. And the idea was, Lake Nemi, actually. And the idea was that person who was that priest needed to basically defend this very sacred tree that you were never allowed to take a branch from. If you did, it led to having to fight the priest in a battle. and the priest could be killed. It was a rule that the priest needed to die for trying to, in other words, that priest at some point killed someone to become the priest, and it was fated that eventually they would have to die. So the idea was that you would have to die by the same mechanism that you killed someone. And this is very interesting because remember that how did Brandon Wilson kill himself?
He
I mean,
hung himself.
how did he die? He killed himself, right?
Yeah.
And remember, his story was that he had to sacrifice the child. God told him to. He thought he had to sacrifice the child because he was an innocent. Well, that's what the priest of Nemi would have done. They were it was about the sacrificing of victims to the gods and protecting that sacred tree. It's interesting, Chris, that you said that he would hang out by the Joshua Tree Park and everything. It makes me wonder if when he was out there, he started fantasizing about being this figure, but the fact that he has it tattooed to himself is amazing, because it means, even though I believe that this was basically a sex offender and a budding serial killer, he did have a kind of bizarre idea that he was at least partially motivated by some, probably drug-addled kind of idea that he was this spiritual defender and that he was doing something for a higher purpose and so forth. But obviously, Chris, that was all kidding himself.
Yeah.
He was basically a perverse person with a dark heart. And but isn't that interesting that he identified with that priest of Nemi, that had to defend the goddess? I guess that's his mother.
Well, it's fascinating to hear you,
Yeah.
because obviously at the time,
Yeah.
It just goes to show how these guys, right, Gary? I mean, this is the first time even you've seen this.
I just happen to know the story of the.
Yeah, and I haven't released this into the public until today, and you nailed it, because in the entire interview, he's talking about, I don't know if I, want to drink the blood of this one. Is there a correlation to this Rex, right? To this priest, to this high priest?
Yeah.
And, he's talking about sacrifice. I need a pure sacrifice,
Right.
in the interview with me. And maybe at one point I'll play the other parts of it.
Right.
But yeah, it was fascinating.
He knew that it was determined that he knew right from wrong. He wasn't, even though he was a strange guy, I think drugs had contributed to his mind being a little aberrant. But remember that well before he got involved in drugs, he had been fantasizing about brutally killing his mother.
Yes.
So no one in the audience should get any fantasy that, he was perfectly fine until he took drugs or lost his mind or something.
I think and they level set his IQ in the high 140s.
That's interesting. Well, he didn't sound that way when he was talking about but I know that some people are going to say, well, oh, come on. I mean, he was mentally ill, so forth. As far as I know, he was not suffering from a diagnosed mental illness. He was a person who had fantasies, like a lot of budding serial killers, about leveling the playing field against the person that had humiliated and hurt him by committing some absolutely atrocious violent act toward them. And then later in life, under stress and also with the wheels greased by drugs, went out and enacted it against a total innocent who suffered essentially because he couldn't make it work with the female victim that he had singled out, which I'm sure left him feeling humiliated again. And this is what I want the audience to understand. Okay, there is a kind of mental illness there, a personality thing, right? Perverse sexual interest, so forth. But those things are, in the common parlance, what a lot of people mean when they're talking about evil. So we're not talking about like diagnosing him psychiatrically. We're talking about how this would have looked to the world. And that is the kind of case. I mean, I think you would agree, Josh. That's the kind of case you're reading about in the paper and you go, wow, that's just evil. Right?
Yeah.
And that's just it. So we're not talking about what really biologically was up with him and so forth. And I'm sure he would have met criteria for some kind of character pathology, drug use, paraphilic disorder. But that doesn't mean he didn't know the difference between right and wrong. He did. That was well established in the court case. And in fact, he wanted to be sentenced to death, and then he killed himself. He cheated the family even out of the experience of his execution, Chris.
Yeah,
He
no,
ended
it was.
up in jail, right?
Yeah, I was in Nevada. I was in Reno teaching at the Washoe County Sheriff's Department. I was given a class, and my phone went off. And it was 10 years later,
Mm.
and I pick it up, and one of the guys at the department, he says, "Hey, have you heard the news?" I said, "No, what's up?" He goes, "Wilson killed himself. He hung himself in San Quentin on death row.
What do you use?
A bed sheet of some sort, or a piece of clothing that he had cut and made it into a noose."
So a guy that cut a child's throat and stabbed him had access to something sharp enough to cut bed sheets.
Well, welcome to death row in San Quentin.
Sometimes all they do is just take plastic bags with a lighter and melt it into a knife. I mean, they're pretty clever. They got a
creative.
lot of time to think about.
So Josh, have you encountered evil?
Not like either one of you. And it more so after the fact and things like that, to be completely honest with you. But I will tell you that I'm reading a book called The Right Wrong Man, and it's about a man who sought refuge here in the United States after World War II. His name was John DeMoniuk out of Cleveland, Ohio. He was revoked of his citizenship in the United States because he was believed to have been Ivan the Terrible from the Treblinka death camp.
Oh yes, okay.
As I was reading the book, and he ended up on trial in Israel in 1987. And there was a particular man there that was there to testify that was in Treblinka and witnessed what was going on. And I think that we can all just 100% agree that the death camps ran by the Nazis were evil. And there was like you said, there was no reason for them to be doing what they were doing. However, when I was listening to this man talk about John DeMoniuk, or who he referred to as Ivan the Terrible, and they named this man Ivan the Terrible because of his particularly brutal approach to the people in the Holocaust, meaning what he said was he would walk around with a knife or a sword and just whack people with it for the fun of it. And one thing he said that, and it actually gave me a knot in my throat. And he goes, as he's putting people into the gas chamber, because that was his job, he would torture them before they got in there. And he says, and nobody was even telling him to do it. He was just doing it.
That's
and
the extra.
and he was, and as he's telling this story, he's bawling. And I'm going, so you have these people who are just scared to death, and you have this insane man running around torturing these folks on top of that, because they said that, and they all agreed, he got a thrill out of it. He liked it. And then when the war ended,
Right.
he sought refuge in the United States and was here till 1987 as a perfect citizen. Which, I find he had a family that stood by him and all this stuff. And it was later on proved that they weren't sure if he was Ivan the Terrible, but it was proven that he was a death camp operator who did terrible things. They recognized him as the person that did these terrible things. But when he said that, I just remember it, like I said, it gave me a knot in my throat, because the man was struggling to testify already. I mean, he had waited, I don't know, 50 years, to get his shot to testify against him. And when he said he would do these things to people on the way into the gas chamber, and he says, and nobody was even telling him to do it. He just wanted to.
Well, you see, this is very, very interesting because when Michael and I were writing, one of the points we made was that we were talking about personal cause evil, not the kind of evil that's committed by states or terrorist groups or gangs or, Nazis or whatever. Of course, that's evil. But we
Sure.
were interested in personal. But this is the thing. What we found was that within one of those groups, there can be people who, even outside of that worldview, would have been serial killers or sexual sadists or whatever, and they got a permission structure from what was going on. So that what you had in the Nazi party, for example, were some people who were just a little, they would go well beyond because they were given carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to the prisoners. And they would start to do things that revealed that they probably were sexual sadists or so forth. For example, I remember the man you're talking about, one witness saying that he punished a man by creating a very tiny wooden box that the man had to crouch into and then covering the wood with nails so that if there was the tiniest movement, there'd be tearing with the nails. And eventually, what the witness said was that after enough time, because the person became tired, he said, I remember it like it was yesterday when I read it. The witness said that the screams no longer sounded human, which is a very haunting idea, right? And so what you're touching on is the idea that there are different degrees of aberrant personality and willingness to do what we would call evil, even within a
Well,
society construct or a gang or organized crime. You know what I'm saying?
well,
So
what
the
stuck
first
out, yeah, what stuck out to me was that already what was going on was evil. It was already evil that what was happening to these
oh, yeah.
people was it was just disgusting. And then you have, like you said, somebody who gets gets their gets their tickles, gets their jollies from doing this kind of stuff. And I mean, there's one thing to be said, about, I guess, the way that people would like to say that, well, he was a death camp worker, and he certainly was, and anybody that was involved in that is terrible, and it was awful. But he was going so far above and beyond what was even it,
Extra.
and it would and when that man said that, the way that he said that, he was an old man when he was saying it. I just couldn't but help but go, he,
Right.
how scary,
Of
how
course.
how that now you that would be, you're in the, not only are you in hell on earth, but then you're in the presence of absolute evil. And I would think that
Yeah.
John Demjanjuk would be on that list.
But I'll tell you what I said in the introduction to the book is that I was it was very difficult writing the new evil, right? I remember Michael, who was I'm going to talk about this in the new book, but I remember Michael sitting me down and saying, if you're going to do this project with me, I want you to understand that we're going to talk about things that pretty much nobody talks about. And he said, your brain is going to have to find a way to compartmentalize it. And being an analyst, he said, if you're anything like me, and we were a lot alike, he said, it's going to come out in your dreams. So keep track of them. And you're going to see how you're struggling to compartmentalize this stuff. And of course, he was right. I mean, I could tell you things that were, nightmares and things I had as I was learning to put this stuff in a trunk mentally. And the idea is that Michael and I struggled with a very great deal is Michael and I have met many of these offenders. Michael, for example, had correspondences and visits with some of the most infamous offenders of the last century, right? And I've met a few of them too. And the hardest thing for us is that sometimes we like them.
Yeah.
They were like,
It's a cup of Joe.
yeah, you found yourself liking them and it made you want to vomit. And the
Yeah.
reason is, and I've talked to, for example, a wonderful psychologist and dear colleague of mine, Catherine Ramsland. We've talked about how the problem is that the general public wants to think that people who do evil things become these archetypes, like they are the embodiment of evil, like they're like like the living devil or something. But the problem is it's too simplistic. The reality is that there's a fragment of the person that is capable of this stuff, and then there's this other part that could actually be like a loving father, or like a politician, or a church leader, or a loving husband, or something. It's very strange. And and there are different opinions about how that happens. Like, for example, Al Carlisle, the psychologist, Dr. Carlisle, used to talk about compartmentalization and how a person could split even unconsciously into these different. But I think that degree of dissociation makes it sound almost like multiple personality or something. That's not quite what we meant. Um, um, and Catherine has talked to BTK, the BTK killer, about cubing, where you intentionally show different fragments of the self. But I think that that's the scariest part about it, is the realization, as Michael Stone used to tell me, I'll never forget it. He used to say, sitting at that desk in his cluttered office, "Remember, Gary, every one of us walks a tightrope from Buddha to Bundy."
I like that.
And he was 100% right. And that is the scariest part of this stuff, is that if we take off the table that you have to be crazy or diabolical or whatever, then you start to understand, wow, these people have my DNA,
Mm.
right? We're all children of Cain. And that is, I think, the scariest part of the whole thing, is that the person next door could be a boogeyman. I think, as my final point here, and I want you guys to kind of jump in with your final thoughts here, is when I was talking to Michael about it, what we would also talk about how is that the existence of evil proves that there has to be a counterpart. There has to be goodness and love and denial of the self. And in every truly evil story, there were also always people in the same story who clearly were good and who did good, and who were the hero, who were the Ann Burgesses, right? Chris, we were just talking to her on the interview room, a great hero of ours. The people who helped the victims, the law enforcement, the ambulance, and the firemen, the people who work in the hospital and a victim and save their life, or the priest or the rabbi or the imam or whoever that consoles the family that demands justice, the judges, the lawyer. In other words, that's where you've got to look to get away from the evil. And so I just think, what I would really, if we're talking about this very grim subject, I just really would like the audience to understand that they should go out into the world and make choices to do good, to
Well,
level out some of this darkness. I'd love to hear you guys, your final
well,
thought.
Dr. Gary, it is a grim subject, and the thing is, the way that you present it, you do it with class, and you do it with education, and you do it with
Right.
just knowledge, so it's appreciated. You're not just
Yeah.
some schlub that is a visiting
A
scholar or
schlub?
something.
Is that a word?
Yeah.
A
Oh, big
schlub?
Like
Gary's a New Yorker. Is schlub a word?
oh yeah, like that.
It's you
Well,
did.
like they're a little nothing,
It's
like a talentless
yeah, like
person,
a hack. Yeah.
no attractive qualities, basically.
Oh,
Right.
you mean like somebody on YouTube? Is that what you mean? Do you mean
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a troll?
Like a fake
Schlub?
visiting scholar or something like that.
Yeah, fake.
Stuff like
Um,
that. But you do come the way that you present it to us, because a lot of this is well beyond most of our comprehension, and really
Evil, evil is by definition beyond
I
our
would
time.
I would think so. And like when you ask me if I've ever encountered it, I mean, I think that it's all around, but to pick it up the way that maybe, you guys have talked to people. I remember my grandmother, when I've only heard her say this one time, and I can't remember who we were talking about, but I mean, she turned to me, and when I was telling her about this certain story, and she would go, that's evil." And I don't think she understood exactly the definition of it, but that was what came to her mind in this horrific story. And it's not a word that she uses often or ever really. So when you tell her something that is so outlandish, about a case or whatever, I remember one time she just turned to me and she says, "Josh, that's evil." And I would say,
Right.
"Yeah, I mean, I guess it is."
Yeah. And remember, it's only people that can do evil, because animals, even if they could do it, wouldn't. It's very practical for an animal. You
Right.
kill to kill. Only a human would do something like stick a person in an Iron Maiden, or like put them on a stretch rack or something. That little extra. It's not necessary for an animal. That's why I don't like when people say, "What an animal he was." You
I
know,
begin to think that way
say
too.
that. They
Actually.
shouldn't say that. They should say, that is a true human to be capable of that. And I'll say, when
Well,
we
Gary, real quick, when you say somebody, what kind of an animal would do that? You would say a human.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Only human. But that's a good point. But when we were on with Ann Burgess yesterday in the interview room celebrating her because her Hulu show is
Great,
coming
great
out,
show, by the way, guys.
Mastermind. And she knows a thing or two about evil. She's encountered it firsthand. We were talking about how one model of serial killing is like a drug addiction, where you keep going out and topping the thrill, right, and doing worse and worse things. And what I had wanted to say, but it was so packed with people, we didn't have a chance, is the whole culture is like an organism that is being desensitized. The culture is like a person that is being exposed to more and more and more and more and more, and it's not enough. So that if you think of people across time like a person being exposed repetitively to something, we're now at the point where it takes an awful lot to shock and horrify us, which means that the average offender, to shock and horrify and do something evil, has to go pretty high on that scale that Michael and I talk about, so that now the common crime is something that was like the crime of the century last year. Last century, right? And so like you almost have to like be amused at the quaintness of murders that used to happen in the in the last century, the first part of the last century, right? It was like some guy was mad at his girlfriend and hit her on the head and killed her, and that was the end of it. Now it's like butchery, dismemberment, killing children, mutilating people, going out with guns in public and blasting people for no reason, etc. So I think, Chris, what I would say is the culture is getting coarser and is being broken down by too much exposure to acts that I would call evil. And
Yeah,
we're getting desensitized.
I agree with that 1,000%. That's one of the things I've been, concerned about for my grandchildren. If we take a look at the word evil itself, and we just scramble the letters a little, we get the word veil, veil,
Mm.
which is a covering. And opposition in all things, even the word in of itself, has a reflection of God in it. And it just makes us think, can we discern that word? And if so, what does that mean for each of us as individuals? And for each of us, it is an individual discernment, not only for our society, but to your point a moment ago, we're already at the point where you see things that are just horrific, and you go, oh, okay, it's almost become entertainment. It's become entertainment. I mean, just fights and riots and, all the different social problems. And yet we're willing to step aside and go, yeah, but, he's a nice guy. Well, and then what? Right? Where do we go from here?
Before the fall, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, Goebbels, just think if he would have had the internet, how successful he would have been. So, but think about that word, evil, and then think about it as a veil, veil. the chameleon aspect of that.
Right. Well, we always get into the religious and and that I think we could save for another conversation. But it is interesting to think about the idea that from the Christian perspective, which we often discuss, the idea that there's a figure who embodies evil and whose purpose is to break the relationship that humans have with God out of a kind of an envy of them. And there's no reason to do it other than spite. And I always thought one of the worst insults that Christ ever hurled was to compare some people to the devil and say that they're like their father who was a liar from the beginning. What a zinger. Imagine.
It's about as bad as you get.
It's about as bad as it can get to be compared to a being who exists for no reason other than to fight the maker.
By Christ.
And the people that are being called that think they've spent their entire life righteously. That's the most disturbing part. And and that's the thing, I think, when we can't forget that evil comes in all forms, and every one of us sometimes commits little extra inappropriate, outrageous acts even in our private lives, and we should uproot them and instead work very, very hard to do little acts of love. I think in the simplest form, Fulton Sheen, the great bishop and televangelist, actually said one time when asked for the simplest definition of evil, says very simple, it's the anti-cross.
Thank you for listening to The Witness Box. I'm your host, Joshua Diaz, alongside Chris McDonough, Dr. Gary Brucato. Thank you all for being here with us. Thank you for all the support and the kind messages. You can get a copy of Dr. Gary's book, The New Evil, on Amazon or at a local bookstore near you. Catch Chris McDonough on The Interview Room on YouTube. And you can check me out on YouTube as well, The Lab. And you can catch all three of us right here on The Witness Box. Thank you for listening.